computer. I sent you the recording from yesterday. And remember, there's a way to do traductia where they have the auto-translate at the bottom. That's something I just discovered this year. So our topic now is the Jewish denominations in the 19th century. And I want to share with you a few things. First, I'll talk about it, then I'll share some of the sources that you have, and then I will try to explain. And I think I'll use that if possible, if there's a way. So, okay. When I left off last time, we talked about the emancipation. The emancipation, which happens in Western Europe and almost at the same time in the United States, is the giving of individuals rights. And individuals get passports with their name and not the names of the minorities or the communities that they might be part of. And as you can imagine, the idea within the Jewish communities of emancipation was seen as both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because finally Jews might be given rights. Whether that actually happened that way exactly or not, we'll talk about it. But that was the idea. And whenever Jews in those countries felt that they were given rights, they also always got very excited. Because unfortunately, very often the hopes would be destroyed even before the event would happen. If you remember the story here in Romania, I think it was 1864 approximately, when Jan Cuzac was putting together a government, and he told the Jews that they would have equal rights. But unfortunately, his government was against. He couldn't do it. And because he couldn't do it, Jews in Romania became very Zionist. And you had the first Zionist convention here in Romania in Focșani the year after. In other words, they felt like it's not working here. So that's what happens. You know, you build up an enthusiasm and you hope something is going to happen. And then when the hopes are dashed and they don't seem to work, so you have to think of other possibilities. The same thing happened in Eastern Europe when Eastern European Jews, especially in Russia and Poland, looked west and saw the emancipation happening in Germany and France and England. They got excited. But as soon as they realized that the Russians were not interested in doing that, so Judah Leon Pinsker writes a book called Auto-Emancipation. In other words, if we want to emancipate, we have to emancipate ourselves, and he becomes a Zionist. So, right. Okay, but let's get back to this. So in the 19th century, then, you have the beginning of the 19th century, you have emancipation. It is a major political change and atmosphere in Europe. And as in Germany, for instance, the rabbis were divided. On the one hand, Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was a rabbi in Hamburg and a great believer in emancipation, because he said, you know, the idea of recognizing Jews, giving them rights, that's good. Whatever the outcome will be, will be. But you can't blame a good deed because somebody might misuse it for the wrong thing. On the other hand, other Orthodox rabbis thought this was not a good idea because when we lived in small communities, the possibility of becoming part of another religion or becoming secular was impossible. Who would accept you? But now that Jews want to be a part of society because they're given rights, they might leave the fold. By the way, that's exactly what happened. Take, for instance, Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn was considered one of the fathers, maybe the father of the Jewish Enlightenment movement in Germany, who was a very traditional Jew, what today we would call modern Orthodox, let's say. Out of his 7 children, 6 of them converted to, probably Protestantism, which was the type of Christianity practiced in Germany, because in those days, secularism was not an option. So if you wanted to be accepted, you had to enter the religion of that country, which is what many Jews did. Today, what people do is they become secular, because in most countries, let's say in most Western countries, secularism is the majority of the people. And so, yeah. So anyhow, so that's just a description of things. This continues, by the way, for a very long time. Continues all the way to the First World War. This idea of Jews leaving the fold. At the beginning of the 20th century, you have Franz Rosenzweig, a Jewish thinker who wrote a book called The Star of Redemption. Rosenzweig was from a very assimilated Jewish family. His mother was a little bit traditional. She would go to the synagogue on the festivals, but that was it. And Rosenzweig, like a lot of Jews that day in Germany, if they didn't convert to Protestantism, then they were about to convert to Protestantism. And he wrote a letter to his cousin who had converted already. And he said, before I convert, I want to first go to the synagogue, because I've never been to the synagogue. So it doesn't make sense to convert when I've never been to a synagogue. So he decides to go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur. His mother finds out about this and she says, don't come to my synagogue because we don't like people who are going to convert the next day. So he looks for another synagogue and he's wandering the streets of Berlin and he comes across what today we would call a shtibel. A shtibel is a very tiny synagogue, which usually 30, 40 people get together. And it's usually people who are quite devout, so they don't like the pomp and the grandeur of large synagogues.
How do you spell shtibel?
Shtibel, it's actually from the Yiddish word shtub, which means a house. So shtibel, S-T-I-B-E-L. Shtibel. Shtibel, yeah. The word shtub. So Rosenzweig comes across this little place. He sees that the synagogue, walks in, and he sees people praying with great devotion. And he had never seen that before. He always thought that all these ceremonial things people did without thinking about it, without any feeling. All of a sudden, he sees Jews that actually believe in their Judaism. He'd never seen that in his life. He was a man in his 20s at the time. So after Yom Kippur is over, he writes his cousin and he says, I think I don't know enough about Judaism to convert out. That doesn't make sense. And then he spends the rest of his life trying to understand what Judaism is all about, which is an interesting figure. He lives at the beginning of the 20th century. He actually fought in the First World War, and he died between the wars. So let me just, I want to read to you the first source. I translated it with auto-translate, so I don't know how good the translation is. So if I ask you to read the translation, do so and make corrections as you're doing so. Yes. Okay, can you see it's right? It's the first one from today. And it says 19th century and emancipation. It's taken from Rabbi Sachs's book called Orthodox Alternatives. A moment. Does somebody want to read the traductia? There might be mistakes, so you'll have to make correct it at the same time. Laura, you want to try? You can't find it? It says in Urma, it's on page, let's see page numbers, page 4. 4. Yes, it's the one. Yes. 200 years ago, yes. It says 200 years ago? Okay, so please read in Romanian. If it doesn't make sense, something, then try to correct it. Okay? No, they won't hear you if you don't say it loud. You have to talk into the computer.
În urmă cu 200 de ani, în 1789, contele de Clermont-Tonnerre a ținut un discurs în adunarea națională franceză. Revoluția franceză a inaugurat la începutul acelei vechi statul democratic modern. E un English.
Yes, but clearly and slower, yes.
Adunarea națională făcuse declarațiile importante ale drepturilor omului. Toți oamenii se nasc și rămân liberi și egali în drepturi. Întrebarea a fost, aceste drepturi se aplică evreilor? În teorie, da, dar teoria era contradicție sentimentul public. A existat un antagonism puternic față de evrei, în special în Alsacia. Țărănimea locală s-a revoltat împotriva populației evreiești. Ca răspuns la rapoartele revoltelor, contele s-a ridicat pentru a ține un discurs. Legea, a afirmat el, nu are nicio grijă de credințele unei persoane, este interesată doar de acțiunile sale. Evreii, prin urmare, au drepturi egale în cadrul statului. Dar dacă evreii ar fi parte din națiunea franceză, ei nu ar putea fi în același timp membri ai națiunii evreiești. Evreilor ar trebui să li se refuze totul ca națiune, dar să li se acorde totul ca indivizi. Dacă ei nu vor acest lucru, trebuie să ne informeze și atunci vom fi obligați să expulzăm. Evrei erau o religie sau o națiune cu propriile legi de guvernare și patrie.
Okay. Very good. Sure, there's something wrong. There's always something wrong with Google Translate. Okay, so let me go over this. I don't know, but I'll go over it. Yes, right. Right. So this story in 1789 of Count Clement Tonnerre making this speech in the French National Assembly. Oh, and the question really is, on the one hand, because of emancipation, everybody should be receiving rights, but everybody is receiving rights as an individual and as a member of the nation, French nation. However, the Jews have to decide, are they a religion or they're a nation? Because if they're a nation, they can't be both part of the French national nation and also of another nation. That's what he said. So, now the truth is, it's a very strange thing to say when there at that time there were very few Jews living in Israel and it didn't belong to the Jewish people. It would actually make more sense, let's say, the argument about whether Hungarians living in Romania see themselves as a nation or not, because there is a country called Hungary just over the border. But here it's a very funny thing to say when there's probably no French Jew who even thought about going to Israel, which was under the Ottoman Empire at that time. So it almost looks like a smokescreen trying to disclude or exclude the Jews from the question. So the question was then, in theory, these rights apply to Jews, but they have to decide if whether they are part of the French nation or whether they're part of the Jewish nation. It's interesting, Napoleon Bonaparte, he created his Sanhedrin. He took 70 rabbis from all over France and asked them whether they're interested in going to Israel, because he wanted to understand that. And they all said no, because they were afraid. Okay. It would have been interesting to know what would have happened if they said yes. He might have surprised them. Okay, but they were all afraid. They all said no. And they probably had no intention anyhow. But I'm just saying it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened if they would have said yes. He did have that possibility, you know, he did attack Acre. So in Israel. So that's the first one. I want to read you a second one. This is taken from a book much, much later. Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a French philosopher, existentialist, wrote a book in 1944, which was the end of the Vichy government. And the name of the book was Réflexions sur la question juive. And Sartre has a lot of interesting things to say here, but I just want to talk about one specific thing, which talks about exactly this problem. The problem of definitions when it comes to the emancipation. The Jews are being emancipated. But what does that mean? And in 1944, it still means different things to different people, but there seems to be one basic problem. So let's see this one also in the traductia. Hopefully this traductia will be a little bit better. You can make it larger, by the way. It doesn't have to be so small. Yeah. Okay.
Evreii au un singur prieten, democratul, dar el este un protector slab. Fără îndoială, el proclamă că toți oamenii au drepturi egale. Fără îndoială, el a fondat Liga pentru Drepturile Omului, dar propriile sale declarații arată slăbiciunea poziției sale. Democratul, ca om de știință, nu reușește să vadă cazul particular. Pentru el, individul este doar un ansamblu de trăsături universale. De aici rezultă că apărarea evreului îl salvează pe acesta din urmă ca om și îl anihilează ca evreu.
In other words, his defense of the Jew saves the Jew as a man, but annihilates him as a Jew. So basically, for the Democrat, it's like, if he turns to the Jew, he says, I want you to be recognized as equal, but please don't talk about different religious things. Don't wear a kippah. Just, keep that at home hide it so nobody can see any different. But then that's an intolerant society. Okay, so this is the struggles that go on. On the one hand, you want to accept people as equal, but you're not willing to accept their differences. When I was growing up in Canada in the 1970s, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was the father, started this thing in Canada. They called it multiculturalism. In other words, the Canadians celebrate their differences. This is an important step. It's not easy, by the way. It's easier to say than to actually do it. It does help when all the minorities want to do it, but the more the government preaches and educates toward this, the more the minorities feel more relaxed about these things. And then the next generation has a chance also of blending in. So that's what I think. It worked in Canada. It works better when also you control the numbers of people flowing in, because it takes 2 generations for this to happen. But it does work. But you have to mean it. That's the hard part. Yeah. Okay. Last thing. This is indirectly connected. It's also connected. This is Martin Buber writing in the 1960s. Martin Buber was originally from Germany, and he actually moved out of Germany, I think even between the wars. He later on was a professor at the Hebrew University. And he wrote a book called The Jew in the World, which was not his major book. His major book was called I and Thou. It's a book about existentialism. He gives it a slightly Jewish point of view, but the book is really very general. And but this book is essays about Jews. Buber himself was not a religious Jew, but he was very interested in Judaism. Okay, Verog, if somebody would like to read the traductia, it's just at the bottom. And again, I apologize for Google and Meta. Who would like to read? Somebody else? It'd have to be somebody near here. Would you like to read? Great.
Grupul evreiesc nu poate fi încadrat în nicio schemă cunoscută. El rezistă tuturor categoriilor istorice și conceptelor generale. Este unic. Existența a tot ceea ce nu poate fi înțeles și înțeles. Aici este. Deci existența a tot ceea ce
este cumva strâns într-o
wrong traduction. Această stare de lucruri se mândrește ca o bază pentru adevărul că antisemitismul este un fel de frică de fantome. Israelul nu se încadrează la cele 2 categorii cel mai frecvent invocate în încercările de clasificare, o națiune și un crez. Națiunile experimentează istoria ca națiuni. Ceea ce experimentează indivizii nu este istorie. În crezuri, pe de altă parte, experiențe importante sunt suferite de indivizi și în forma lor cea mai pură și sublimă. Aceste experiențe sunt ceea ce numim revelație. Când astfel de indivizi își comunică experiențele maselor și veștile lor determină formarea unor grupuri, ia naștere un crez. Națiunile și crezurile diferă la fel ca istoria și revelația. Numai într-un singur caz ele coincid. Israelul primește experiența sa religioasă decisivă ca popor, comunitatea, aici it's wrong again. Israel experimentează istoria ca revelație și revelația ca istorie. În ceasul experienței sale de credință, grupul devine un popor.
Almost intellectual. Okay.
Yeah.
So Buber's really saying is, and I think he's writing this as somebody who grew up in Germany. And what he is saying, I'm just in a class now, okay? Yeah. He says that, and when he says the Jewish group cannot fit into any known category, he's really talking about from a European point of view, because in antiquity, every nation had its own God. So in the time of the Bible, that was very understandable. In the Bible, the only thing they didn't understand was why the Jews claimed that their God is the only one. But it was not unusual that people had a God. But in Europe, as nationalism grows, you have a differentiation between nationalism or nationhood and religion, and it's not seen as the same. The two monotheistic religions, which are not Judaism, meaning the Islam and Christianity, see themselves as universal religions of many ethnicities and many nations, without any particular connection. The fact that somebody might be from Rome does not mean that they are more Christian than somebody from Turkey. And whereas nationhood does not necessarily connect to a particular religion. You could be from Japan and you can be Shinto and you can be Christian and it doesn't really matter. You can be from China, and if you're not communist, but you could be Tao, you could be a Buddhist, etc. So the point is that it's seen as two separate categories, religion and nationhood. But the Jews who come from antiquity, we've always seen nationhood and religion as the same, because when Jews became a nation, it was at the time when it was the same. So today, it seems like an odd thing, but it's not odd when you understand when the Jews came from. It's also, so basically and there's an organic connection. The connection is so organic that on the one hand, a Jew who does not believe in God is still Jewish, which in other religions is not necessarily so. I know a lot of people, I'll ask them what religion, and they'll say nothing. But their parents were religious, but they're not. Right? Oops. And on the other hand, a person can convert into Judaism, which is a religious statement. So if it's a nationalist thing, how can you convert? Very often, by the way, people come from communist countries who are still communist, right? They, especially the former Soviet Union, but even here, the previous generation, they see their Judaism as ethnicity. There was, whereas if you take Jews who live in countries which have been democratic for a long time, very often the Jews see their Judaism as a religion. American Jews will say, I'm an American and I'm Jewish. One is my nationality, one is my religion. Sometimes they'll say, okay, I also have a connection to the Jewish nation, but I don't live in Israel, so I am American. That's the way they'll answer, okay? So you know the story that Golda Meir had a had a meeting with Richard Nixon in the 1973 October War, the Yom Kippur War. And she said, Richard, I don't understand. You're not sending us the weapons we asked for. We're in the middle of a war. How can you do this? You're a Jew also. I said, Mrs. Meir, let me correct you. First, I am a human being. Secondly, I am an American. And third, I am a Jew. So Mrs. Meir said, it's a good thing in Hebrew we read from right to left. Yes. So, yeah. So you'll see that sometimes in the United States specifically, Jews will say, that might be my religious views, but what does it have to do with being American? On the other hand, there was a poll taken in 1991 in the major cities of the former Soviet Union, which had just fallen a year before. It was done in Minsk, in Kiev, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the questions, different questions among Jews living there at the time. One of the questions was, can a Jew believe in Christianity? Most of them said they didn't see the problem. Because for them, being Jewish was an ethnicity, it wasn't a religion. They had lived under communism their whole lives. Nobody believed in any religion, really. So they didn't see it as a problem. Right? If you would ask a Jew in the United States, they wouldn't understand what you're talking about, even if they were secular. Because they see Judaism as a religion. So this was, by the way, a problem that happened in the modern state of Israel. In 1961, there was a fellow who came to Israel, and his name was, Oswald Rufeisen. Oswald Rufeisen. Oswald Rufeisen was born in Poland. He was born between the wars to Jewish parents. And in the war, he was taken by the Nazis and he escaped. And since he had perfect German, I think the family moved from Germany to Poland. So he claimed that he was German, and he was actually worked as a translator, different places. And what happened was, because he was able to be like undercover, he was able to save a lot of Jews by informing them in advance things that were going to happen. At one time he was caught and he was arrested, and he was saved by the church, and he was brought up in the church. After the war, he was in France, and he decided to convert to Christianity. Not only did he convert to Christianity, he studied theology and he became a Franciscan monk. I'm not sure it's Franciscan, one of the monasteries that worked in one of the ones that had representation in Israel. It could have been Franciscan. 1961, they sent him to Israel to work for them in one of the churches. Once he was in Israel, he requested to be Israeli under the law of return because his parents were Jewish. Misrad HaPnim, the Ministry of Interior, refused. Said, not only are you not Jewish, you're a priest. That doesn't make sense. So, but from his point of view, if my parents were Jewish, that's all that's required. So went to Israeli Supreme Court, right? We're talking a lot about the Supreme Court. This was at different times of the Supreme Court. Went to the Israeli Supreme Court, and 7 judges were asked this question. And Oswald Rufeisen, by the way, who was called Brother Daniel, that was the official name in the church. Can Brother Daniel make aliyah? Can he be under the law of return? 4 out of the 7 judges said no. It doesn't make sense that if he believes in Christianity, he calls himself a Jew, because Judaism is also a religion. So you cannot say that. It didn't make sense. That's what happened. By the way, because of that, they changed the law of return. The law of return in 1951, when it was first passed by Ben-Gurion's government, said that any Jew could make aliyah, and there was no definition. In 1971, they had to redefine the law of return because of this Supreme Court ruling, and it was added to the law of return that if a Jew believes in another religion, they cannot make aliyah. Under the law of return, they can naturalization, but not under the law of return. Okay, so this is the same question, because Judaism sees itself as both. as a nation which has a belief. I've always said the best way to understand this from a modern point of view is we're like one big family. In a family, some people are born into the family, and some people marry into the family. Right? But when they marry in, you'd like them to share the same ideas that the family believes in. That's an easier way to understand it. You know, in the book of Amos, chapter 3. So Amos says, in the name of God, "Rak etchem yadati mikol mishpachot ha'adama." Only you have I known from all the families of the earth. Uses the term family. So it's an interesting connotation. Right? Amos calls the Jews a family. It's the extended family of Jacob. Okay, so I brought this because these are really the main issues come to light after the emancipation. Now, what happened in Germany in particular, there was a major exodus of Jews into German society, which meant that they de facto converted to Protestantism. Did they believe it or not? I can't tell you. But they knew that it would not be accepted unless they converted out. So they figured we'll convert to Protestantism. So they'll see us as equals. And whether that was a wise decision or not, I think not, because by the end of the 19th century, with racial theories developing in Germany, anti-Semitism raised its head all over again and decided that Jews are not even a religion, they're ethnicity. And therefore, it doesn't matter if you converted. If you remember, in the Inquisition in Spain, which started at the end of the 15th century, even before the expulsion, in the Inquisition, if you converted to Catholicism, that was okay. As long as you were a true Christian, it was fine. For the racial theories of the end of the 19th century, it didn't matter what you converted to. You were ethnically a Jew.
The Inquisition didn't introduce limpieza de sangre, wasn't a racial conflict.
There probably was,
Inquisition.
could be, because like you have in Don Quixote, Sancho Pancho is talking to Don Quixote, and he says to him, I am a better Christian than you because I'm an old Christian and you're a new Christian. By the way, some people think that the author might have been a converso. Because why does he call Don Quixote a new Christian? So, it's just speculation, but it's an interesting speculation, maybe. Remind me of the author again. Don Quixote. Cervantes, yes. Yeah, it's just speculation, but it's interesting that he calls Don Quixote a new Christian.
Writing thing.
Writing thing? Could be just a writing thing.
They exposed all the Jews, not only.
No, I think officially the ones who converted, they did not expel. But
they couldn't have administration jobs, and they couldn't preach if they were free. Weren't allowed to.
Even though Torquemada had Jewish roots. Yeah.
Yes.
And he was the head inquisitor.
Indeed.
Yeah. So anyhow, So what I'm saying is that by the end of the 19th century, all those who converted to Christianity was meaningless. This is way before Nazism, because basically the society didn't want the Jews, so they had to look for a different reason. And the reason now was, I remember one time I had this trip to Poland. I had a trip to Poland 9 times. And we would go to Jewish sites and to Shoah-related sites, because you still have synagogues there, especially in Krakow. There's a lot to see. But, and I had this one fellow, his father was Jewish, he was from the United States, but his mother was not, and he converted to Judaism. And he was this big fellow with a big beard and a couple of tattoos. So he looked like a rock star, sort of like, the type you find on, what do they call it, Grateful Dead or something like that. And so he told me that when he was in Warsaw, he went to some bar just to talk to people. And he was talking to people, and he said he was from Israel, whatever. So he's talking to some guy, and this guy says, well, we're not the same. So he says, and why are we not the same? He says, because you have different blood than I do. So you picked the right guy. He was a convert. He said, you have different blood. This is the same, the type of thinking from the end of the 19th century, that as if the DNA is different. People become different by changing themselves. You can be wicked or you can be good. This is what you decide. Your DNA, you don't decide. And more or less, all our DNA is the same. The difference between us and a squirrel is maybe 5% of our DNA, maybe even less. It's like only 1%. So, the differences between human beings are a percent of a percent. It's really nothing, really nothing. We're really all the same. But it's okay, we can feel different. Some people like feeling different. So they'll rip their pants, but they'll rip their pants in the same place that everybody else rips their pants, or else, or they'll put on a whole bunch of tattoos, but they have to put the tattoos the same place the other guy put the tattoo, right? So they're really following the line, even though they're pretending to be different, because you can only be different when everybody allows you to be different, because you have to follow the herd. Yes. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. One of the big issues that happens during I see there are other people here. Can I have okay, there's some people who joined. I have to write down. Kodina is here. Right. Who else just joined? And Maddie Kitu? Right. Yes. Anybody else? Who did I miss? Okay. Please, yes, please take.
With you at the end, if you want.
Oh yeah, sure, of course. Yes. Okay. So let me try to explain what happens. One moment. What's the name of this? Okay. Okay. I saw Mirella. What? Oh, sorry. Thought I'd get away with it. Yes, I think, yeah, merci. As I said, we're going to finish around 5:30, 5:35. Yeah. Okay, so what happens exactly? Let's go back to the beginning of the 19th century. What are the reactions to the emancipation within the Jews? And we'll use Germany as an example. The first reaction is a tidal wave of people moving out from Judaism. And this is not secularism, because secularism was not yet an option in Europe. So they take upon themselves another religion. Are they committed or not? I don't know. I don't know how committed other people are. I knew this woman from Wrocław, and she was born into a family which was not Jewish, but they had suspicion that their grandmother was Jewish. Why do they have suspicion that their grandmother was Jewish? Because for some reason she kept all the customs of both the Orthodox and the Catholics, and only a Jew would do that. Who else would keep all the customs of the Orthodox Christians and the Catholics at the same time, just in case, right? So yeah, which is very interesting. Yeah. So there was a fellow Boaz Pash, was a rabbi in Krakow for about 6-7 years. He was sent by this organization And he learned Polish very quickly. He's very good at languages. He was also in Portugal, and he learned Portuguese. And so he told me a story one time. Maybe I told you that there was a fellow from the community, because they have this group called Children of the Shoah in Krakow, whoever's left alive, and they have meetings every Sunday in the JCC, in the Jewish Community Center, which was actually built because of a contribution that was brought by King Charles, who was prince at the time. He came to Krakow, and he's wondering if there's still Jews in Krakow. They said there are some. He says, well, you need a Jewish community center. So he talked to people in England. They sent money. He didn't do it, but he talked to others. Yeah. So anyhow, so he went to visit this fellow from the group, and the guy lived on the other side of the Vistula River. So he said, look, nobody in my building knows I'm Jewish. So if you come to visit me, wear a hat over your kippah. And you have peyot, these long sides, put them under the hat, please. And if you have tzitzit, let them, nothing Jewish, please, because, I don't want everybody to know. Okay. So he comes, he wears a long coat. He comes to this guy's house. He's about to knock on the door. He looks on the sign, Michael Goldberg, like nobody's going to know he's Jewish. Now, people live in their own imaginative world. So, but I can tell you that even in Montreal, where we had a very large group of Shoah survivors who came to Canada after the war, a lot of them were still hiding being Jewish for the rest of their lives. It's like you can't get out of it. It becomes an obsession. And this girl from Wrocław, who I talked about just before, she lives today in the United States. I met her when I used to go to the Jewish Music Festival in Krakow, which is the last weekend in June every year, and it goes for 10 days. And it was at the what do they call it? They have a museum which they call Galicia Museum, founded by this photographer, Galicia Museum. She's sitting in the Galicia Museum, and this woman who's a Shoah survivor turns to her and says, if you were in the Shoah, they wouldn't know that you were Jewish. It's like a very strange thing to say. But okay, if you were in the Shoah, they wouldn't know you were Jewish. But that's what, that's what they're thinking about 70 years later. Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to this. So what actually happens? The first thing, and this is how it should be understood, in my opinion. The first reaction to it. Now, can you see this? Just move over a bit. Too far? You're a little bit close. Okay. No, that's okay. No, you can see me instead of the board. Okay. Let's call this emancipation. I should have put it at the bottom of the board. The first reaction is, I call it assimilation. And assimilation is a sense of assimilating into the larger populace. So if it's in Germany, they're assimilating into German Protestant Christianity. To be part of the majority, that's really the reason. This is not because they had an epiphany or whatever. So that's reaction number one. Reaction number two starts through certain Jewish leaders in Germany at the time, and it's the Reform movement. Reform Judaism. Now, we've had denominations in antiquity which disappeared. I talked about them. Sadducees, Essenes, Karaites, etc. But the goal of Reform Judaism was to create a Judaism that looks closer to Protestantism, so then there's no reason to have to convert out. You have to understand Reform Judaism as a need to stem the tide, to stop the tide, to limit the tide of assimilation. It's not like in the United, well, maybe it is a little bit, but I'm just saying the goals were very different then. You see a mass exodus of Jews, and especially more liberal-minded rabbis were saying, this doesn't happen to have to happen. We can make Judaism more accessible. But when they say accessible, they mean changing the line. So now this happened very slowly. The first Reform temple was set up in 1818 in Hama. But the first Reformed temple is very traditional. There are two basic exponents, I would say, ideologically of Reform in Germany at the time. One is a fellow by the name of Geiger. And the second one is Emanuel Holdheim. Geiger, by the way, studied in what they call, what do they call it again? Getting mixed up. It was the Wissenschaft der Judentum in Breslau. It was the scientific study of Judaism center in Breslau, which also graduated rabbis. By the way, in that same graduation class, you had Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who becomes a leader of Orthodox Jews in Germany, and Geiger. They studied together in the same place. Geiger is a liberal, and there was actually a congress, a convention of liberal-minded rabbis in Braunschweig in 1840 approximately, or 1844, talking about things that can be done to make Judaism more liberal, to make it more friendly to the people who look like they're about to leave. Geiger proposed doing certain things, bringing the organ into the synagogue. It would be played by an angel. Then it's like a church. Let the rabbi wear the robes, just like the ministers. Not with that. And we can pray in the vernacular in German. It doesn't have to be in Hebrew. These were little things. Took it to a whole different level. Why do we need all these ceremonial laws? Let's do the more ethical ones where people can relate to. Why do we have to talk about that God is going to resurrect the dead one? We talk about these things. They don't seem logical. Why does the Siddur have to talk about going to Israel? We're not planning to go to Israel right now. So Holdheim took it to a whole different level. And that was an argument. There was two different directions, Geiger and Holdheim. And because of this convention and a few others that happened almost in the same year, you had two paths within the reformers. One was the path of Holdheim, which took reform more and more the liberal side and moved away from what we call today. And the second path was the path of Geiger, which tried to make a much more, let's say, moderate type of reform movement. But because you had these more extreme views, you had a break already after the convention of Braunschweig. There was a fellow whose name was Zechariah Frankl, who was also from like and Frankl basically said, this is going too far. We have to create limits on the Zechariah Frankl is considered the ideologue which later becomes the conservative movement in the United States. They see him as their forerunner. He also influenced Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter was the first president and chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which became the main rabbinical school for the conservative rabbis. And Solomon Schechter was actually a Romanian Jew from Moldova, who went to study in Cambridge. And he was the one who also, in Oxford. And he was the one who discovered the Cairo Geniza, which is today in the Oxford Bodleian Library. And they took him to be the chancellor of their rabbinical school somewhere around 1910, 1913, something like that. But that's an American development. So what you have in Germany at this point are three movements. Movement number one is the movement, it's assimilation. Movement number two is reform. Movement number three is modern Orthodox. What is modern Orthodox? Modern Orthodoxy, that's the third reaction. The modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox is really the major exponent of the self-racial movement. Well, they said, but they sort of split parts. They went different ways. Hirsch is very interesting in the sense that, on the one hand, he embraces Jewish law, but he also embraces the emancipation. In his book, The Letters to Ben Uziel, which is today called the 19 Letters, letters about being a Jew in Germany in the 19th century. It's actually an interesting book to read. Some of it is a little antiquated, but it's still an interesting book. So Hirsch embraces emancipation. He thinks it's a good thing. He also embraces the idea of going to university and studying the sciences. He calls it Torah im derech eretz, which in the rabbinic literature means Torah with morality, but he takes it to mean Torah with a livelihood. He just reinterprets the word derech eretz, which could mean both, actually. Derech eretz, the way of the land. So he says Torah with a livelihood, but to have a livelihood, you have to go to university. Today, that's not necessarily true, but it definitely helps. I mean, you could just go into business, you could, but yes. So his Torah and derech eretz was the idea that we need Jews to study both Torah and to be worldly. And he didn't see the problem with that. These are the challenges of life, and if you have the ability to think and you don't, then you won't have the equipment to deal with the challenges of life. So for his point of view, he didn't see any problem with both. You know, there was a book written by Chaim Potok, who was called The Chosen. I don't know if you heard about it. Was it translated to Romanian by Sefer? Yeah, same author. Yeah. Okay. So the Chosen is about a young Hasidic boy who has a friend who is modern Orthodox, who is studying in a high school where they also have secular studies. And they're trying to understand each other because the Hasidic boy doesn't go to any secular studies at all, but he's very interested in things. So in his discussions with his friend in high school, they're talking about with this guy, and then the Hasidic boy decides to go to the library and start reading about Freud and about science or whatever. And at the end of the story, the Hasidic boy enrolls to Hirsch College, named after Samson Raphael Hirsch. Hirsch College, by the way, which really refers to Yeshiva University in New York. He calls it Hirsch College. Hirsch College, where they both study, they can study Torah and they can also study for a university degree. I just mentioned that because that exactly was Samson Raphael Hirsch. And by the way, Yeshiva University does use that slogan, Torah with derech eretz, meaning Torah with an occupation. They use that slogan. So even though they see themselves as students as Rabbi Soloveitchik, which is a slightly different point of view, but Soloveitchik also agreed that a person should be worldly, but the slogan came from Samson Raphael Hirsch. One of the paradoxes of Samson Raphael Hirsch is that he can be seen as the father of two prototypes at the same time, or maybe even three, because on the one hand, the Haskalah, the early Haskalah in the first quarter of the 19th century in Eastern Europe was a very moderate Haskalah, which a lot of them were traditionalists. So they would have seen no problem with Samson Raphael Hirsch. They would say, look at this guy. He's both an Orthodox rabbi and he went to university. He's Rabbin Doctor. Okay? That was the first Rabbin Doctor. That was in Germany. Then it takes off in France and England, but there was no such thing before that. In fact, the Polish and Russian rabbis used to make fun of the rabbin doctor. Like, when do they have time to study Torah if they had to get a doctorate? But so this was just, a different way of looking at things. By the way, at that time, there were a lot of rabbis in Eastern Europe who were autodidact, but they didn't go to universities. But one of the reasons they didn't go to universities was also because they weren't allowed to most of the time. But I'm just saying, even when they were allowed to eventually, it became unusual, let me put it that way. So, let's see. Okay, so so Hirsch, in a sense, becomes the father of he becomes sort of the theoretical, ideological patron of three movements within Judaism in the 19th century. One is the Haskalah. Again, eventually the Haskalah disconnects itself with Hirsch because by the second half of the 19th century, they become secularists. But in the first quarter, they were not. So they would have had no problem with Hirsch. In fact, he would be somebody who would be an icon for them. The second one, of course, is what's today called modern orthodoxy. Jews who embrace modernity and secular studies, like I said before. And there's quite a lot of them today, especially in Western countries. The third is actually the Haredim, what we call the ultra-Orthodox. Why? Because, interestingly enough, Hirsch was a very big opponent of the Reform. He was very vocal in his opposition of the Reform, to such an extent that, remember, in Germany, the government used to give funding to the various religious denominations. So there was funding to the Jewish community to pay the rabbis, for upkeeps of synagogues. Hirsch demanded that his followers be recognized as a different denomination than the rest of the Jews, because he didn't want to have anything to do with the Reform. You would think he would have been more tolerant because of his other beliefs, but no, he didn't want to sit with them in meetings on a board, and the government agreed. And he was the first of what we call the insular and separate community. It's a separate community from among the Jews. The first separate community happened in Hamburg under Hirsch. Now, today, the ultra-Orthodox communities do not see Samson Raphael Hirsch as their patron, even though, as I said, ideologically, they could have. But the reason why they don't is because they don't accept his idea of Torah with their authority. They don't want a rabbi to be rabbi doctor. So where did they get the idea of the insular or separate communities? From somebody who lived at the same time as Hirsch, or slightly before, but more or less at the same time, which was Moses Sofer, the Chatam Sofer, who lived in Pressburg. Pressburg today, of course, is the capital of Slovakia, which is Bratislava. So he lived in Pressburg on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sofer, I think it was Moshe. Chatam Sofer, they used to call him, based on his book. I can tell you in a moment. Chatam Sofer, I think it was Moshe. Second. Yes, Chatam Sofer. Chatam Sofer, Moses Sofer, 1762 to 1839. So he was really, he would only have known of Hirsch as a young man. Hirsch was born around 1808. So, Hirsch would have been in his late 20s, so he probably didn't know him. But the Chatam Sofer and his followers also created this idea. They also fought the Reform, which wanted to make its way into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and did to a certain extent, but in a very moderate way. You have like Neolog, a very moderate type of reform. But they did, following what Hirsch did, eventually they took upon themselves a separate community. So today, if you ask an ultra-Orthodox Jew, a Haredi, who is their prototype, they would say the Khatam Sofer, Moses Sofer. They wouldn't say Hirsch. But I'm saying the idea came from Hirsch, and then it was applied in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Don't smoke from somewhere, but yeah. Somebody's smoking something. Yeah. Okay, so you have three major movements that happen at the same time. Assimilation, the reform, maybe it'll stem the tide of assimilation because we can show Jews you don't have to be, you know, you can create a Judaism that looks very much like Christianity. And then, of course, you have modern Orthodoxy, Samson Raphael Hirsch. These are the three movements that are basically, in a sense, a reaction to the emancipation. And they all started in Germany at that time. The movements change as Jews move west and east. By the beginning of the 20th century, remember, in the 19th century, Jews started moving out of Europe by the end of the 19th century and moved west to the United States in particular, but also South America, Canada, England, Ireland. You know, they say, how did the Jews from Eastern Europe get to England? Because they wanted to go to the United States. So the boats would play tricks on them. They would take them to England and say, they're speaking English here. This is the United States. So they left them off in England. That's how you got Jews in England. So then some of them were smart. And they said, but we didn't cross the ocean. So they would go out to the ocean. They would come to Ireland, leave them off. We cross the ocean. They speak English here. This is the United States. That's how you have a few Jews in Ireland too. Right. And so there are very few today. Jews start coming to the United States in the 19th century, German Jews. The first Jews who came to the United States actually came from Holland, Portuguese Jews who came there for business, and they came to New Amsterdam as early as the 17th century. And in fact, there's a synagogue which is built in Rhode Island called the Truro Synagogue. And it's built in 1772. Rhode Island is a state in the United States called Rhode Island, the smallest state. It's about the size of the state of Israel, but it's a very small state in the United States. It's called Truro. The Truro Synagogue is the oldest standing synagogue in the United States. It's built by Portuguese Jews. And it still stands today. You can visit it. It was built in 1772. The United States became a country in 1776. And in that synagogue, the president sent a letter to George Washington, who at the time was General George Washington, and he asked that Jews would receive equal rights when the United States became a nation. And Washington wrote them back and says, absolutely, that is our intent. And that letter is on display when you walk into the synagogue. I don't know if that's the original or a copy, but it's definitely on display in the synagogue. But an interesting thing in the synagogue is when you come there, on the bima, which is in the middle, the podium, where they read the Torah, there's a trap door, which means the Jews who came there were not sure what type of future they were facing. Would they need the trap door to hide the Torah scrolls if somebody would try to destroy the synagogue or not? It was not clear. They did have a trapdoor. And you can see that also when you go to the synagogue today. So, what was I talking about? Yes. So in the United States in the 19th century, you have a lot of German. First, you had Portuguese Jews at the beginning who came to New Amsterdam, which eventually becomes New York. And then you had German Jews who came also to do business, and they were the ones who created some of the institutions that exist till today. For instance, B'nai B'rith. It's created in the 19th century by German Jews. But the German Jews who came to the United States were predominantly Reform Jews. So the Reform movement was one of the early movements in the United States. In 1888, there is the first convention of Reform American Judaism in Pittsburgh. They call it the Pittsburgh Platform. The Pittsburgh Platform is a statement of the beliefs of Reform Judaism. You could look it up if you want. I'll show you from Wikipedia, the Pittsburgh Platform. Okay. 1885. Taking it from the Jewish Virtual Library. The Pittsburgh Platform was a formulation. Here, I'll show it to you. The Pittsburgh Platform was a formulation of principles agreed upon by the Reform movement of the Pittsburgh Conference in 1885. Convened in New York, and it was chaired by Isaac Wise, who was one of the well-known figures of Reform Judaism in the United States. The principles agreed upon symbolized the merger of Eastern U.S. and Germanic wings of the Reform movement, and distinguished it from Orthodox and conservative Judaism. And there were revisions done in 1937 in the Columbus Platform. Let me just read you just a few things of this. Number one, we recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite. And in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling God, meaning we recognize the legitimacy of any religion, which is a funny thing for a religion to say as a first statement. Usually it's like the 25th statement, but it shows the direction already. We hold that Judaism represents the highest conception of God taught in our holy scriptures, and according to the moral and philosophical progress of the ages. We recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific research are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its life in Palestine, and today we accept as binding only the moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies that sanctify life. We reject all such which are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So basically, Reform in the United States is taking a much larger leap than German Reform. They do not see the mitzvot, the commandments of the Bible, as something which is an obligation, except for the moral code of the prophets. The morality of the prophets, yes. Keeping the Sabbath, no. Morality of the prophets, yes. Eating kosher, no. Just trying to make it more tangible for you to understand what they're saying. We hold that all Mosaic and rabbinic laws which regulate diet, feastly purity, dress, originated ages under the influence of foreign ideals, meaning ideals which are foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They do not impress the modern Jew with the spirit of holiness. Their observance in our day will only obstruct rather than further modern spiritual elevation. I think you got it already, right? That's it. Okay, so this is Reform in the United States. I have a friend who grew up in a Reform temple. They call themselves temples, synagogues, in the 1970s. At his bar mitzvah, he wanted to wear a kippah, and the rabbi told him he's not allowed to. Okay, just understand what Reform was, even as late as the 1970s. Also, the Reform until 1970 was non-Zionist, because they didn't understand what the point of Zionism is. Why create the largest Jewish ghetto in the world? We want to move out of the ghetto. We want to be part of the greater world. So basically, the Reform Judaism was non-Zionist, except for Stephen Wise. He was an exception, and Abba Hillel Silver, two Reform rabbis who were an exception. But in general, they were non-Zionist. In 1970, they adopted a more Zionist platform because it was already after the establishment of the State of Israel, and it didn't make sense anymore to be anti-Zionist. So, okay. So until now, so I don't have much left. I have about 7 minutes left. I talked about, really in a nutshell, denominations that start flourishing after the emancipation. Assimilation is not a denomination because it's Jews leaving the fold. And what happens in the diaspora, they leave and they disappear. And we are used to that. We have Jews who were conversos in Spain, they disappeared. So, and we have Jews who have assimilated over since the emancipation in many, many countries, and they have disappeared. There's a question today whether in the United States there are 5 or 6 million Jews. Nobody really knows because there has not been a census since 1960. Meaning there's been a census every year, but there's no census where you have to answer the question of your religion or ethnicity since 1960. So there's no way of knowing. In 1960, there were 5 million Jews in the United States. Now, how many are there in 2023? Nobody really knows. Some people say 5 million, some people say 6 million, but nobody knows. But you also have at the same time that you have the Jewish community grows due to immigration. A lot of Jews moved to the United States. A lot of Russian Jews moved to the United States. Israelis. The assumption is that there are at least 500,000 American Jews who have an Israeli passport, at least. Of course, it could be people who were in Israel just for a few months, because you can make Aliyah and Allah return, you get an Israeli passport, you can leave right after. So some of them were probably for a short amount of time, some of them for a longer amount of time. At least 500,000, that's the speculation, maybe even more. So you do, but then the Jewish community should have grown a lot, not just a little, but at the same time, you have Jews disappearing. And you still have assimilation, which is secularism. They don't necessarily embrace another religion, they just fall out. And since you don't know who they are, and that's it. And in 2 generations, they're not going to know either. You'll have people like Elvis Presley, who didn't even know that his maternal grandmother was Jewish till later. Anyhow, but he did not consider himself Jewish, and it makes sense. The fact that he had a Jewish grandmother, the fact that Judaism recognizes that he had a Jewish grandmother, and therefore, it's not an argument for an individual. People make their own decisions, They don't ask rabbis what the decision is. So you have a lot of Jews who don't necessarily see their religion as meaning much to them. That's just life. So anyhow, so you have 3 movements. You have assimilationism, which is not a movement. These people, their grandchildren, will have no connection. This is not communism where people were forced to be secularists. This is not anti-Semitism where people hid their. This was just an attempt to move ahead in society. Then the Reform movement is a movement which made a lot of sense, I guess, in Germany at the time. It also made a lot of sense in the 19th century United States, which really seemed like a whole different ballgame, as we would say. So people thought the Reform would make more sense. But what happened was, and they didn't plan this Reform, by 1880, there were massive waves of immigration to the United States from Eastern Europe, which means Russia, Poland, Lithuania, mostly, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And these waves were mass waves of Jews. We're talking about anywhere to 30,000 to 80,000 Jews per year coming to the United States. I think it was closer to 80,000. Every year since 1880, until the United States closes its doors in 1930. Immigration. There are already 5 million Jews in the United States in 1930. Now, these Jews who come from Eastern Europe are all traditionalists. They've never seen Reform Judaism. It doesn't make sense to them. And when they come to the United States, it is obvious that the Reform is going to have to do something if they want to attract the new Jews. That's why you have the Columbus Platform in 1935, where the Reform tones down its opposition to Jewish, call it ceremonial laws, okay? And because it realizes that's going to antiquate itself if it doesn't do so. Now, these Jews who come to the United States, and my grandmother was one of them, at least her family came, somewhere from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1880s. She was born in New York City, but her mother came with her too, who was not born in New York City. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century. She's not alive anymore. And they came to New York, like most people, to Ellis Island. They lived in the east side of the city. And then as they moved to other places as they had more money. And my grandfather worked as a peddler. He was selling things on the street because it was either that or working at a work where you had to work on the Sabbath. So if you were a peddler, you didn't have to work on the Sabbath. So these Jews were traditionalists. Even the ones who had to work on the Sabbath were traditionalists. It just didn't work. Their main language was Yiddish, and the German Jews spoke German. They didn't speak Yiddish, if they remembered the German. In fact, when these Jews came to the United States, there's a law in the United States at the time that to immigrate, you had to know a language which is a recognized language. You had to know how to read and write in a recognized language, and Yiddish was not recognized. So there was an organization called YIVO, who published a book by Uriel Weinreich, which was called College Yiddish, to prove that Yiddish is a real language. And it became a bestseller of those who study Yiddish. So, and the HIAS and JIAS, the Jewish Immigration Society, and the Hebrew Immigration Society, turned to the United States, saying that Yiddish is a real language, and so eventually that was accepted, and that was how these people were able to get in, because that was what they spoke. There's a story about a guy who comes to the United States. It's getting late. I'll tell the story next time. So I have to go in a few minutes. So what happens is the conservative movement begins really in the 1880s in any significant way. It starts off by some of the same people who set up Yeshiva University, by the way. The idea of the Jewish Theological Seminary at the beginning was a rabbinical school which spoke English, because that was unusual. People spoke Yiddish. The rabbis would speak English and a little bit more open-minded. That was the idea. When Solomon Schechter, rabbi professor, comes to the United States to lead JTS, he's the one who also decides it should have a university track to it. It should be a rabbinical school with university studies, and everybody will get an MA in Lettera. Because he called it an MA in letters, Hebrew letters. That's exactly what he called it, Lettera. So, and because the United States, you call it humanities, you call it Hebrew letters, and that's exactly what they give. They give a BA and an MA in Hebrew letters. And they created an institution that at the time was considered Orthodox. They called themselves conservative because in England, the Orthodox called themselves conservative. Okay? But next time when we talk online next week, I'll talk a little bit more about the conservative movement, which is a very American phenomena. Interesting phenomena, American phenomena, and modern Orthodoxy, which takes its own understanding in the United States. And then when we finish that, I'll also talk about the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, which is also a reaction to emancipation, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in Poland and Russia. Okay, merci beaucoup, everybody. Thank you for joining. I have to